A 9-year-old boy with a broken leg dragged his bleeding 6-year-old brother out of their locked basement during a house fire. When neighbors found them collapsed on the lawn, the boys' whispered confession about their stepfather's punishment room made them call 911. The basement was always cold. 9-year-old David Miller pressed his back against the concrete wall and tried to find a comfortable position for his throbbing left leg. The break had happened 2 days ago. He could still hear the sickening crack when Rick's boot connected with his shin, but the pain hadn't gotten any easier to bear. If anything, it was getting worse. The leg was swollen now, purple and yellow bruises spreading like spilled paint across his pale skin, and David was pretty sure it wasn't healing right. But telling Rick about the pain would only make things worse. Beside him on the thin, stained mattress that served as their only furniture, 6-year-old Jake shivered in his Pokemon pajamas. The little boy's blonde hair stuck up at odd angles, and his blue eyes, so much like their mother's had been, were red-rimmed from crying earlier. He had stopped the tears hours ago, but David could see the fear still lingering in his brother's face. "I'm hungry," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible in the dim space. David wrapped his arm around his little brother's shoulders, pulling him closer for warmth. The single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows on the bare concrete walls, making their prison feel even smaller and more oppressive than usual. There were no windows down here, no way to tell if it was day or night except for the sounds filtering down from upstairs. The creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of the television, the occasional clink of glass against glass that meant Rick was drinking again. "I know you're hungry, buddy," David said softly, ruffling Jake's messy hair. "But we just have to wait a little longer. Rick will let us out when he thinks we've learned our lesson." Jake nodded solemnly, though David could see the confusion in his little brother's eyes. They both knew Jake hadn't done anything wrong, not really. The coffee mug had been an accident, a simple slip of small hands as Jake tried to clear the breakfast table like Rick had taught them. But Rick didn't believe in accidents. Rick believed in consequences. This basement room had become their world over the past 2 years, ever since Rick married their mother and moved into their house on Maple Street. What had once been their father's workshop, back when their real dad was alive and the basement smelled of sawdust and possibilities, had been stripped bare and converted into what Rick called his punishment room. The workbench was gone, along with the tool pegboard and the half-finished birdhouse their father had been making for their mother. Now there was only concrete, a bare bulb, the stained mattress, and a white plastic bucket in the corner that served purposes David tried not to think about. Rick had rules about the punishment room. Clear, simple rules that he'd explained to them with the patient tone of someone teaching important life skills. When they misbehaved, and Rick's definition of misbehavior was broad and ever-changing, they came down here. The door would be locked from the outside, and they would stay until Rick decided they had learned their lesson. Sometimes it was a few hours. Sometimes it was overnight. Once, when David had dared to ask about calling their grandparents for Christmas, it had been 3 days. "No food, no water, no whining," Rick would say, counting off the rules on his thick fingers. "You think about what you did wrong, and you don't come out until you can tell me exactly how you're going to do better next time." The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold, or even the cramped discomfort of sleeping on the thin mattress. The worst part was listening to Rick moving around upstairs, living his life as if 2 children weren't locked in his basement. They could hear him watching television, talking on the phone, sometimes even having friends over. The sounds of a normal life happening just 20 feet above their heads while they sat in the dark, forgotten and disposable. David shifted his weight, trying to ease the pressure on his broken leg, and winced as pain shot up from his shin to his hip. The injury was his own fault, really. 2 days ago, Rick had been in one of his moods, the dangerous kind that usually started with too much beer and evolved into lectures about respect and responsibility. Jake had been practicing his letters at the kitchen table, carefully copying the alphabet from a workbook their teacher had sent home. But his pencil grip was wrong, his letters uneven, and Rick had decided this was unacceptable. "Look at this chicken scratch," Rick had said, grabbing the workbook and waving it in Jake's face. "What kind of boy can't even write his own name properly? You're 6 years old, not 3. Act like it." Jake had started crying, quiet, scared tears that only made Rick angrier. David knew better than to interfere when Rick was in correction mode, but watching his little brother tremble with fear had overridden his common sense. "He's trying his best," David had said, stepping between Rick and Jake. "Maybe if you showed him instead of just yelling." The kick had come without warning. Rick's work boot, still muddy from his construction job, connecting with David's shin with enough force to drop him to the kitchen floor. The pain had been immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot spike that made him see stars. But worse than the pain was the look on Rick's face. Not anger, but cold satisfaction, as if he'd just solved a problem. "That's what happens when you disrespect me in my own house," Rick had said calmly, stepping over David's writhing form to grab Jake by the arm. "Now you both get to think about appropriate behavior downstairs." They'd been here ever since. 41 hours by David's count, though time moved strangely in the windowless basement. Rick had checked on them twice, once to deliver his standard lecture about learning from mistakes, and once this morning to inform them that they'd be staying put until he was satisfied they understood the importance of not breaking his things. "When do you think Mom's coming back?" Jake asked suddenly, his small voice cutting through David's dark memories. David's throat tightened. Their mother had died 6 months ago in a car accident on Highway 407, but Jake still talked about her like she was just away on a long trip. David understood why. Accepting that she was never coming back meant accepting that they were truly alone with Rick, with no one left who loved them unconditionally. "I don't know, buddy," David said carefully. "But wherever she is, I bet she's thinking about us." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that made the basement feel a little less cold and hopeless. David had become an expert at these kinds of lies over the past 2 years. Small, protective untruths that helped Jake sleep at night and kept him from asking the questions that had no good answers. The truth was that their mother had known about the punishment room. Not officially, not in any way that would have required her to act, but she'd known. She'd seen them disappear downstairs after Rick's lectures about discipline and respect. She'd heard David's careful explanations about why they were so tired, why they sometimes flinched when Rick raised his voice, why Jake had started wetting the bed again at age 5. But their mother had been broken in her own way. Their father's death in a factory accident when David was 7 had left her struggling to keep their house, to pay bills, to function as a single parent with no support system. When Rick appeared, charming, employed, willing to take on a widow with 2 young children, she'd grabbed onto him like a life preserver. And when Rick's true nature emerged, she'd been too dependent on his income, too afraid of being alone again, too worn down by grief and stress to fight back. "Maybe she just got lost," Jake continued, building on his own hopeful narrative. "Maybe she's trying to find her way back to us." "Maybe," David agreed, though he remembered the funeral service with perfect clarity, the closed casket, the flowers, the way Rick had held their hands during the burial with what everyone assumed was paternal comfort, but which David had recognized as ownership. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made both boys freeze. Rick was coming down, his heavy work boots thudding against each wooden step with deliberate slowness. David felt Jake tense beside him and automatically shifted to put himself between his brother and the door, despite the agony the movement caused in his broken leg. The basement door opened with its familiar squeal of hinges that needed oil. Rick filled the doorway, a big man in his early 40s with calloused hands and graying hair that he kept cut short in a military style left over from his army days. He wasn't drunk, David noted with relief. Rick was bad enough when he was sober, but alcohol made him unpredictable in ways that terrified both children. "Well," Rick said, his voice carrying the tone of a disappointed teacher addressing problem. Students. Have we had enough time to think about our actions? David struggled to his feet, using the concrete wall for support. His broken leg screamed in protest, but he forced himself to stand as straight as possible. Rick respected strength, or at least the appearance of it. Showing weakness only invited more punishment. Yes, sir, David said clearly. We've talked about it, and we understand we need to be more careful. Rick's pale blue eyes studied David's face, looking for signs of defiance or dishonesty. After a moment, his gaze shifted to Jake, who was still sitting on the mattress, clutching a stuffed elephant their mother had given him for his 5th birthday. And what about you, little brother? Rick asked, his voice deceptively gentle. Do you understand why breaking my things has consequences? Jake nodded quickly, his blonde hair bouncing. It was an accident, but I should have been more careful. I'm sorry I broke your mug. Accidents happen when people aren't paying attention, Rick corrected, when they're being careless and disrespectful. A man's home is his castle, boys, and in my castle, we take care of things that matter. David bit back the response that wanted to escape. That Jake was 6 years old, that accidents were normal for children, that a $12 coffee mug wasn't worth locking 2 kids in a basement for nearly 2 days. But saying any of that would only extend their sentence and possibly earn Jake his own broken bone. We understand, David said instead. We'll be more careful from now on. Rick studied them both for another long moment, then nodded with the satisfied air of a job well done. Good. That's what I like to hear. Growth and understanding. That's how boys become men. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the stairs. Come on up then. I've got dinner waiting, and I expect you both cleaned. Up and at the table in 10 minutes. David helped Jake to his feet, both of them moving stiffly after hours of sitting on the hard floor. Jake's legs had gone to sleep, and he stumbled slightly as they made their way toward the door. David caught him, steadying his little brother, despite the shooting pain in his own injured leg. As they climbed the stairs toward the main floor, Rick's voice followed them from behind. And boys, next time you think about being careless with my things, you remember how much thinking time the basement gives you. Clear? Yes, sir, they both replied automatically. The kitchen smelled like canned soup and burnt toast, Rick's idea of a proper meal. David helped Jake wash his hands at the sink, both of them moving with the careful efficiency of children who had learned that keeping Rick waiting was never wise. The broken coffee mug had been replaced by an identical one from the set, as if the incident that had cost them 2 days of freedom had never happened. As they sat at the small dining table, Rick served them each a bowl of tomato soup and half a piece of toast. It wasn't much after nearly 2 days without food, but David had learned not to complain about portion sizes. Rick had his own theories about childhood obesity and the importance of self-discipline when it came to eating. Tomorrow's Saturday, Rick announced, as he took his seat at the head of the table. I've got some projects that need doing around the house. David, that leg of yours should be fine for light work, and Jake can help organize my tools. It'll be good for both of you to contribute something useful for a change. David nodded, though privately he doubted his leg was ready for any kind of physical activity. The swelling hadn't gone down, and putting weight on it sent sharp pains shooting up to his hip. But arguing would only land them back in the punishment room, and Jake couldn't handle another session so soon after this one. What kind of projects? Jake asked innocently, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Rick smiled, the expression he wore when he was pleased with their compliance. I'm thinking about finishing that storage room in the basement, adding some shelves, maybe a workbench. Make it more useful space instead of just wasted square footage. David's blood went cold. The punishment room was already claustrophobic and intimidating. The thought of Rick making it more permanent, more organized, more like an actual long-term detention facility, made his stomach clench with fear. But he kept his expression neutral, spooning soup into his mouth and pretending this was normal. dinner conversation. "That sounds like a good project," he managed to say. "I thought you'd approve," Rick said. "After all, you boys have spent enough time down there to know what improvements it needs." The casual way Rick referenced their imprisonment, as if it were a normal part of childhood, something to be discussed over dinner, made David feel sick. But Jake seemed to accept it as natural, nodding along as if having a punishment room in the basement was perfectly ordinary. That was what worried David most. Jake was starting to think this was normal. 6 years old was young enough to adapt, to accept whatever reality the adults in his life presented as standard. If they stayed with Rick much longer, Jake might grow up thinking that locking children in basements was an acceptable way to handle misbehavior. After dinner, Rick settled into his recliner with a beer and the television remote while the boys cleaned the kitchen. It was part of their routine. Rick cooked, such as it was, and they handled cleanup. David washed dishes while Jake dried and put them away, both of them working quietly to avoid drawing attention to themselves. "David," Jake whispered as they finished wiping down the counters, "my leg hurts too sometimes." "After Rick talks to us." David's hands stilled on the dish towel. "What do you mean, buddy?" "When he gets mad and grabs my arm really tight, or when he pushes me down the stairs to the basement. Sometimes my legs hurt afterward, but not like yours." David knelt down to Jake's eye level, ignoring the protest from his broken shin. His little brother's arms were thin and pale, but now that David was looking for them, he could see faint fingerprint bruises on Jake's upper arms, marks from Rick's grip during their trip to the punishment room 2 days ago. "Jake," David said, quietly, "you know those hurts aren't normal, right? Rick isn't supposed to grab you hard enough to leave marks." Jake looked confused. "But we were being bad. Mom used to say that sometimes growing up means getting hurt when you make mistakes." Their mother had said that, David remembered, usually when she was trying to explain away one of Rick's lessons, inappropriate behavior. She'd frame Rick's punishments as natural consequences, inevitable parts of learning right from wrong. Looking back, David could see it had been her way of coping with a situation she felt powerless to change. "Mom was wrong about that," David said carefully. "Getting hurt isn't supposed to be part of learning. And breaking a mug by accident isn't being bad. It's just being 6 years old." Jake considered this with the serious expression he wore when processing difficult concepts. "Then why does Rick put us in the basement?" It was a question David had been asking himself for 2 years, and he still didn't have a good answer. Because Rick enjoyed having power over them? Because he resented inheriting 2 children when he married their mother? Because something in his own childhood had taught him that love and violence were inseparable? "I don't know," David admitted. "But I know it's not because we're bad kids." From the living room came the sound of Rick's laughter at something on television. It was a normal sound, the kind of laugh any father might make watching a comedy show after dinner. But it made both boys flinch, a reminder that Rick's good moods could shift without warning into something much more dangerous. "We should get ready for bed," David said, helping Jake down from the step stool he'd been using to reach the upper cabinets. Their bedtime routine was another careful choreography designed to avoid triggering Rick's attention. They brushed their teeth quietly, using as little water as possible. They changed into pajamas without making noise or leaving clothes on the floor. They said goodnight to Rick from the living room doorway, waiting for his acknowledgement before heading upstairs to the bedroom they shared. The room had once been David's alone, back when Jake was still sleeping in a crib in their parents' room. But after their father died and Rick moved in, space had been redistributed according to Rick's vision of efficient living. Jake's crib was replaced by a twin bed positioned across from David's, and the room became their shared retreat from the adult world downstairs. As they settled into their respective beds, Jake clutching his stuffed elephant while David arranged his pillow to support his aching leg, the house grew quiet around them. Rick's television continued murmuring downstairs, occasionally punctuated by the snap and hiss of another beer being opened. "David?" Jake's voice was small in the darkness. "Do you think other kids have punishment rooms?" David stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of their house settling for the night. Through their bedroom window he could see the warm lights of their neighbors' houses, the Hendersons across the street, the Martinez family next door, old Mr. Thompson, who lived alone but always waved when he saw them playing in the yard. "No," David said quietly. "I don't think they do." "Then why do we?" It was another question without a good answer, at least not one that a 6-year-old could understand. How could David explain that some adults were broken in ways that made them dangerous to children? How could he help Jake understand that their situation wasn't normal without terrifying him completely? "I don't know," David said finally. "But I promise you, Jake, someday we won't have one anymore." It was a promise David had no idea how to keep, but it felt important to make it anyway. Jake needed hope, even if it was built on nothing more substantial than his big brother's determination to find a way out of their situation. "Okay," Jake said, his voice already drowsy. "I believe you." Within minutes, Jake's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. But David lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about punishment rooms and broken legs and little boys who thought getting hurt was a normal part of growing up. Tomorrow, Rick would put them to work improving their prison, making it more comfortable for future occupants. The day after that, something else would happen. Jake would make another innocent mistake, or David would say something that Rick interpreted as disrespectful, and they'd find themselves back in the basement with nothing but concrete walls and time to think about their failures. David's broken leg throbbed, a constant reminder of what happened when he tried to protect his brother. But as he listened to Jake's peaceful breathing and the distant sound of Rick's television, he made another silent promise. Not just to Jake this time, but to himself. Somehow, some way, he was going to find a way to get them both out of this house, away from Rick's rules and punishments and twisted ideas about discipline, away from the basement room where children disappeared for days at a time while life went on normally 20 feet above their heads. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find a way. Outside their bedroom window, the neighborhood settled into another quiet Friday night, unaware that just across the street, 2 little boys were planning their escape from a nightmare that masqueraded as ordinary family life. David woke to the smell of something burning. At first, he thought he was dreaming. After being locked in the punishment room for nearly 14 hours, his mind had been playing tricks on him. Phantom sounds of their mother calling their names, imaginary scents of the pancakes she used to make on Saturday mornings before Rick took over breakfast duties with his burnt toast and instant coffee. But this smell was different. Sharp and acrid, like when Rick left the oven on too long, but stronger, more urgent, carrying an undertone that made David's chest feel tight even before he was fully awake. Beside him, on the thin, stained mattress that served as their only furniture in the basement prison, 6-year-old Jake stirred restlessly. His small face was scrunched in sleep, blonde hair sticking up at odd angles, one arm wrapped protectively around the stuffed elephant their mother had given him for his 5th birthday, back when birthdays still mattered, before Rick decided that celebrating children encouraged selfishness and entitlement. They had been locked down here since yesterday evening, when Rick decided that Jake's attempt to pet the Hendersons' cat without permission demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for other people's property. The punishment had been swift and predictable, down to the basement until they learned to think before acting, to consider consequences, to understand that every action in Rick's house required his explicit approval. David shifted carefully on the uncomfortable mattress, trying not to wake his brother while he assessed their situation. His broken leg throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that had only gotten worse during their confinement. The injury was 4 days old now, and David was beginning to suspect it wasn't healing properly. The swelling hadn't gone down. The bruising had spread from his shin to his knee, and putting any weight on the leg sent sharp, nauseating waves of pain through his entire body. But the burning smell was getting stronger, and something about it made every instinct David possessed scream danger. Above them, the house was unusually quiet. Normally, even when Rick was sleeping off a drinking session, they could hear the sounds of life filtering down through the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of settling timber, the distant murmur of television programs from houses nearby. But now there was only silence, broken occasionally by a sound David had never noticed before. A soft crackling, like someone slowly crumpling cellophane, accompanied by a low whooshing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. David sat up, as carefully as his injured leg would allow, using the concrete wall for support. The basement felt different somehow, warmer than usual, and there was something in the air that made his throat feel scratchy and raw. Through the floorboards above, that strange crackling sound was becoming more pronounced, punctuated now by occasional pops and snaps that made the hair on David's arms stand on end. "Jake," David whispered, gently shaking his brother's shoulder. "Jake, wake up." The 6-year-old's eyes opened immediately, instantly alert with the wariness that had become second nature during their time in Rick's house. Children who lived in punishment rooms learned quickly to wake without grogginess, to assess their environment for threats before fully returning to consciousness. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, his voice small and hoarse from the dry basement air. "Do you smell that?" Jake sat up and sniffed experimentally, his small nose wrinkling with concern. "It smells like when Rick burns dinner, but different. Worse." David struggled to his feet, using the wall for support, and biting back a gasp as his broken leg protested every movement. The pain was getting worse, much worse, and he was beginning to worry that something was seriously wrong with the way the bone was healing. But pain was a luxury he couldn't afford to focus on right now. Something was happening upstairs, something that made every survival instinct he had developed over the past 2 years ring alarm bells in his mind. "David," Jake said, his voice tight with growing fear. "Why is it getting so warm down here?" The temperature had indeed risen noticeably in the past few minutes. The basement, which was always cold enough to make them shiver even in summer, now felt almost comfortable. But there was something wrong about the warmth. It carried that acrid, burning smell and made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe, like trying to inhale soup instead of oxygen. David limped toward the basement door, each step sending spikes of agony through his injured shin. The door was solid oak with heavy hinges, painted the same institutional green as a hospital corridor, and fitted with the locks that had become such a familiar and hated sight over the past 2 years. Rick had installed the locking mechanism himself, taking obvious pride in his workmanship as he explained to the boys how the multiple deadbolts could only be opened from the outside. "This is for your own good," Rick had said during that installation, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic facts to slow students. "Children need boundaries. They need to understand that actions have consequences. This room will help you think about your choices and become better people." Now, David pressed his ear against that same door and listened carefully to the sounds filtering down from the main floor. The crackling was much clearer now, accompanied by something that sounded like rushing wind but inside the house. There were other sounds too, distant pops and snaps, the occasional crash of something heavy hitting the floor. And underneath it all, a low roaring that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. Fire. The house was on fire. The realization hit David like a physical blow, making his knees weak and his stomach clench with terror. He pressed his face against the door, trying to see through the gap at the bottom, and his worst fears were confirmed. Wisps of gray smoke were seeping through the cracks around the doorframe, growing thicker and more obvious as he watched. "Jake," David said, fighting to keep his voice calm despite the panic clawing at his chest. "I need you to come over here and help me with the door." "Why?" Jake asked. but he was already climbing off the mattress, clutching his stuffed elephant against his chest. "What's happening up there?" David turned to look at his little brother, taking in Jake's pale face and wide, frightened eyes. The 6-year-old was smart, too smart sometimes, and David could see that he was already putting together the pieces of their situation. The smell, the heat, the strange sounds from upstairs, David's obvious fear and urgency. "There's a fire upstairs," David said as gently as he could manage. "We need to get out of here right away." Jake's face went white. "Where's Rick? Will he let us out?" It was such an innocent question, asked with the absolute faith that adults would protect children in emergencies, that David felt his heart break a little. Jake still believed, despite everything they had endured, that Rick would ultimately keep them safe when it really mattered. David pounded on the door with his fist, putting all his weight behind the blows despite the agony it sent through his broken leg. "Rick!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Rick, there's a fire! We need to get out! Please!" Silence. He pounded again, harder this time, using both fists and ignoring the pain that shot through his injured limb when he shifted his weight. "Rick, the house is on fire! We're trapped down here!" Still nothing. No footsteps, no response, no blessed sound of locks being turned and deadbolts sliding back. David pressed his ear to the door again, straining to hear any sign that Rick had heard him, that help was coming, that someone upstairs remembered 2 children were locked in the basement. But over the growing roar of flames, he couldn't make out anything that suggested human movement. The sounds from upstairs were getting louder and more frightening, crashes and bangs that suggested furniture collapsing, glass breaking, structural elements of their house beginning to fail under the assault of rapidly spreading fire. Jake started to cry, quiet, scared tears that he tried to muffle against his stuffed animal's worn fur. "David, I'm scared. Why won't Rick let us out? Doesn't he know we're down here?" David's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Rick had been drinking heavily when he locked them in the punishment room the previous evening, more heavily than usual, if that was possible. David had watched through the kitchen doorway as Rick consumed beer after beer while heating up a can of soup for his own dinner, muttering about ungrateful children and the burden of raising boys who didn't appreciate everything he did for them. Rick could be unconscious from alcohol poisoning. He could be trapped upstairs by the fire, unable to reach the basement door even if he remembered they were down here. He could have left the house entirely, going out for more beer or to visit one of his drinking buddies, completely forgetting that 2 children were locked in his basement. Or, and this was the possibility that made David's stomach clench with terror, Rick could be dead, killed by smoke inhalation or flames, leaving them trapped with no one in the world who even knew they existed. The neighbors knew David, and Jake lived in the house, of course, but they had no reason to think the boys might be locked in the basement during an emergency. Rick had been careful to maintain the fiction that he was a devoted stepfather dealing with difficult children. If emergency responders found Rick unconscious or dead upstairs, they would naturally assume the children were somewhere else, at friends' houses or with relatives, or any of a dozen other normal places children might be on a Saturday morning. Smoke was definitely seeping through the doorframe now, thin gray tendrils that made the air in the basement hazy and increasingly difficult to breathe. David could feel his chest tightening, and Jake's occasional coughs were becoming more frequent and more severe. "David," Jake said, his voice small and frightened, "I can't breathe very good." David looked at his little brother and felt something fierce and protective surge through his chest. Jake was only 6 years old. He deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to have a life beyond this basement prison. He deserved to be protected and loved and kept safe from harm. And right now, David was the only person in the world who could make that happen. "Okay," David said, more to himself than to Jake. "Okay, we can figure this out." He began limping around the small basement space, examining every surface with desperate intensity. The walls were solid concrete block, poured when the house was built in the 1970s and designed to last for decades. Even if David had proper tools, breaking through would be impossible for a 9-year-old boy with a broken leg. The ceiling was unfinished, exposing floor joists and ductwork and electrical conduits. But there was no access to the main floor that way, just insulation and subflooring that would be impossible to break through without heavy equipment. The single window was tiny and positioned near the ceiling, barely large enough for Jake to squeeze through even if David could boost him up there. But the window was painted shut and covered with a security grate that Rick had installed when he converted the basement into his punishment room. Even if David could get Jake through the window, his little brother would be outside alone while David remained trapped in a burning building. That left the door. David examined the door and frame with the careful attention of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail. The door itself was solid oak, probably original to the house and built to last, but the frame around it was standard residential construction, 2x4 studs with drywall, designed for normal security, rather than containing determined prisoners. Rick had installed good locks, but he wasn't a professional carpenter. The deadbolts were solid and properly installed, but they were only as strong as the wood frame that held them. And that frame, David realized, might be the weak point he was looking for. "Jake," David called, "I need you to help me move the mattress." "Why?" "I'm going to try to break down the door. The mattress will protect you from flying pieces if something breaks." Jake scrambled off the thin mattress, dragging his stuffed elephant with him. Together they managed to wrestle the unwieldy thing across the small space and prop it against the far wall, creating a barrier between Jake and the door. David positioned his brother behind the makeshift shield and knelt down to look him in the eyes. "Listen to me very carefully," David said, gripping Jake's shoulders gently. "I'm going to try to break the door open. It's going to be very loud, and there might be pieces of wood or metal flying around. I need you to stay behind the mattress no matter what happens, okay? Even if it gets scary, even if you hear me making noise or saying things that frighten you, you stay right here where—" "It's safe," Jake nodded solemnly, though his tears were flowing more freely now. The smoke in the basement was getting noticeably thicker, and both boys were starting to cough regularly. Through the floorboards above them, the sound of the fire was growing louder and more urgent. Crashes and roars that suggested their house was being rapidly consumed. "What if you can't break it?" Jake asked, voicing the fear that David was trying not to think about. David looked at the door, mentally calculating his options. He had one good leg and one that could barely support his weight. The door was solid wood set in a frame that was probably 40 years old. He had no proper tools, no leverage, and very little time before smoke inhalation overcame them both. But he also had something Rick had probably never considered when he designed his punishment room, the desperate strength that comes from protecting someone you love more than your own life. "I'll break it," David said with more confidence than he felt. "I promise you, Jake. I'm going to get us out of here." He searched the basement for anything that could serve as a battering ram or leverage tool. Rick's exercise equipment, a weight, bench he never used, and some dumbbells he'd bought during a brief fitness phase was stored in one corner. David examined the weight set carefully and found what he was looking for, a 3-foot section of steel pipe that had once been part of the bench assembly but had come loose over the years. David hefted the pipe, testing its weight and balance. It was heavier than he'd expected, and longer than ideal for the cramped basement space, but it was solid steel and would concentrate his force into a small area. If he could target the weakest part of the door frame, he might be able to break through the wood and metal that held the locks in place. His broken leg screamed in protest as he took up position in front of the door, but David gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute, and through the floorboards above, he could hear the fire spreading, windows breaking, furniture collapsing, the hungry roar of flames consuming everything in their path. They had minutes, maybe less, before the smoke in the basement became thick enough to overcome them both. David raised the pipe above his head, putting all his weight on his good leg, and brought it down against the door frame with every ounce of strength he could muster. The impact sent vibrations through his arms and shoulders, and the sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. His broken leg nearly buckled from the jarring impact, but he could see that he had made progress. The wood around the primary deadbolt had splintered slightly, and there was a hairline crack running up the frame. He struck again and again, each blow loosening the door frame a little more. Sweat poured down his face despite the growing smoke, mixing with tears he didn't remember shedding. Behind the mattress barrier, Jake coughed and whimpered, but he stayed put like David had told him to. The fourth strike opened a visible gap around the lock mechanism. The fifth sent a crack running through the entire frame. On the sixth strike, David felt something give way significantly. Not just the surface wood, but something structural underneath. "It's working, Jake," David called out, though his voice was hoarse from smoke and exertion. "Just a little more." But even as he said it, David could see that the smoke was getting dangerously thick. The air in the basement was becoming genuinely difficult to breathe, and he could feel his strength starting to flag as his lungs struggled to extract oxygen from the increasingly toxic atmosphere. He adjusted his grip on the pipe and focused. His attacks on the weakest part of the frame, the area around the primary deadbolt where the wood had already begun to splinter. Each strike sent fresh waves of agony through his broken leg, but David barely noticed anymore. Adrenaline and desperation had taken over, giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. The seventh strike opened a gap large enough to see daylight through. The eighth loosened the entire lock assembly. On the ninth strike, David heard the beautiful sound of splintering wood as the frame began to fail catastrophically. He wedged the pipe into the largest gap and used it as a pry bar, putting all his weight behind the leverage. The frame cracked, groaned, and finally gave way with a sound like a tree falling. The door burst open with a crash that echoed through the basement like thunder. Smoke poured through the opening immediately. Thick, black, choking smoke that made both boys start coughing uncontrollably. But through the smoke, David could see the staircase leading up to the main floor. Their way out. Their path to freedom. "Jake!" David called, his voice barely audible over his own coughing. "Come on! We have to go right now!" Jake emerged from behind the mattress, his stuffed elephant clutched against his chest. His face was streaked with tears and soot, his blonde hair darkened with smoke residue, and he was coughing so hard he could barely stand upright. But he was mobile, and he was brave, and he trusted his big brother to lead them to safety. David grabbed Jake's free hand and pulled him toward the doorway, both of them stumbling over the debris from the broken door frame. The staircase leading to the main floor was steep and narrow, designed more for utility than comfort, and David's broken leg made each step a monumental challenge. The smoke on the stairs was even thicker than in the basement, a choking black cloud that burned their eyes and throats. David could barely see his own hand in front of his face, let alone the steps beneath his feet. He had to navigate by touch and memory, using the handrail to guide them upward, while Jake clung to his other hand like a lifeline. Halfway up the stairs, David's injured leg finally gave out completely. He stumbled, nearly falling backward, but Jake's grip on his hand kept him oriented toward the top of the staircase. Pain shot through his broken shin like electricity, but David forced himself to keep climbing. Behind them, he could hear new sounds from the basement, creaks and groans that suggested the fire was beginning to affect the structural elements of the house. They reached the top of the stairs, and David's heart nearly stopped. The kitchen was fully engulfed in flames. What had probably started as a grease fire on the stove, Rick had been cooking something when he passed out drunk, had spread to the cabinets, the curtains, the ceiling, and everything else combustible in the room. The linoleum floor was buckling from the intense heat, and the air was so superheated that it hurt to breathe. Flames licked at the doorway leading to the rest of the house, and through the smoke, David could see that the fire had spread far, beyond its original starting point. The living room was burning too. Rick's recliner was consumed in flames, the television had exploded from the heat, and the ceiling was starting to sag ominously. And there, sprawled on the floor near the overturned coffee table, surrounded by empty beer bottles and partially hidden by smoke, was Rick. He wasn't moving. David stared at his stepfather's motionless form, feeling a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't sort through in the crisis of the moment. Rick had hurt them, terrorized them, locked them in a basement like animals being punished for the crime of existing. He had broken David's leg and traumatized Jake and made their lives a daily nightmare of fear and unpredictable violence. But he was also the only adult in their lives, the only person who knew they existed and might theoretically care if they disappeared. And seeing him lying motionless on the floor, possibly dead from smoke inhalation or worse, made David realize just how alone and vulnerable they really were. "Is Rick okay?" Jake asked, tugging on David's hand and raising his voice to be heard over the roar of the flames. David couldn't tell from this distance whether Rick was unconscious, dead, or just overcome by smoke. The older man's chest might have been rising and falling, but it was impossible to be sure through the thick smoke and dancing flames. What was certain was that Rick was in no condition to help them, and any attempt to reach him would mean crossing a room that was rapidly becoming an inferno. "We can't help him right now," David said, the words coming out as a painful croak. "We have to get ourselves out first." The hallway leading to the front entrance was filled with smoke but not yet burning. David could see their goal, the front door with its familiar brass handle and the deadbolt Rick made them check every night before bed. Freedom was 20 feet away, but it might as well have been 20 miles given the obstacles between them and safety. David pulled Jake toward the hallway. Both of them bent low in an attempt to find cleaner air near the floor. The smoke was so thick that they were essentially blind, navigating by memory and desperate instinct. David's broken leg could barely support his weight, and each step sent nauseating waves of pain through his entire body. "Stay low," David gasped to Jake. "The air is better down here." They crawled forward together, David using his good leg and both arms to propel himself while Jake stayed close beside him. The stuffed elephant made the going difficult for the 6-year-old, but David didn't have the heart to ask him to leave it behind. The toy was Jake's last connection to their mother, his security blanket in a world that had offered precious little security. Behind them, David could hear the fire spreading with terrifying speed. Glass was shattering as windows gave way to the heat, and there were crashes and bangs that suggested large pieces of furniture or structural elements were collapsing. The sound was like a living thing, hungry and relentless, consuming their house and everything in it. As they moved through the smoke-filled hallway, disaster struck without warning. A burning beam from the kitchen ceiling, weakened by the intense heat, chose that moment to give way. It crashed down directly in front of them in an explosion of sparks and flaming debris, blocking their path to the front door and showering both boys with hot ash and splinters. Jake screamed in terror and instinctively tried to scramble backward, but David's grip on his hand kept him from fleeing back toward the basement. The fallen beam was massive, probably a main support for the kitchen ceiling, and it was burning fiercely, creating a barrier of flame between them and their escape route. "It's okay," David shouted over the roar of the fire, though his own voice was shaking with fear. "We can get around it." But as they tried to navigate around the burning obstruction, keeping low to avoid the worst of the smoke, another piece of debris, this one from the living room ceiling, came crashing down directly onto Jake's left shoulder and arm. Jake's scream of pain and terror cut through David's heart like a blade. His little brother's Pokemon pajama top was singed and torn, and David could see blood where the sharp edge of the debris had cut through the fabric and into the soft skin underneath. The cut wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely, and Jake was shaking with shock and agony. "Jake!" David dropped to his knees beside his brother, heedless of his own injuries as he brushed away the hot debris and examined Jake's wound. "Oh God. Jake, I'm so sorry." "It hurts," Jake sobbed, clutching his injured arm against his chest while still trying to hold onto his stuffed elephant. "David, it hurts so much." David looked around desperately. The fire was spreading even faster now, consuming the hallway walls and ceiling with terrifying speed. The front door was still their closest exit, but Jake was injured and bleeding. David's broken leg was barely functional, and the smoke was getting so thick that they could hardly see or breathe. But giving up wasn't an option. Jake was depending on him. His little brother needed him to be strong, to be brave, to find a way out of this nightmare. "I know it hurts, buddy," David said, wrapping his arm around Jake's uninjured shoulder and helping him stand. "But we have to keep moving. We're almost out of here, I promise." With enormous effort fueled by desperation and love, David got both of them back on their feet. Jake was favoring his injured arm, blood seeping through his torn pajama top and dripping onto the smoke-stained carpet, but he was still mobile. David put his arm around his brother's waist and half-carried, half-dragged him around the burning debris toward the front door. The heat was becoming unbearable. David could feel his eyebrows singeing, and the exposed skin on his arms and face felt like it was burning even without direct contact with flames. Beside him, Jake was coughing almost continuously, his small body struggling to extract oxygen from air that was more smoke than breathable atmosphere. The smoke was so thick now that David was navigating purely by memory and desperation. He knew this hallway, had walked it thousands of times over the past 2 years, usually on his way to Rick's punishments or restrictions. 27 steps, from the kitchen doorway to the front entrance. 13 steps to the living room doorway. 7 more to the coat closet. Another 7 to the front door. His outstretched hand finally contacted the familiar wood panel of the front door, and David had never been so grateful to touch anything in his life. But his relief turned to panic as his fingers fumbled with the locks. The deadbolt Rick had installed for security, the chain lock that was supposed to keep burglars out, but now seemed designed to keep them trapped inside a burning building. David's hands were shaking violently from adrenaline, pain, and smoke inhalation, making the simple task of turning a doorknob feel impossibly complex. His broken leg was screaming in agony, Jake was crying and bleeding beside him, and the roar of the fire behind them was getting louder and more immediate. "Come on," David muttered desperately, his fingers slipping on the smoke-slicked metal of the deadbolt. "Come on, please." The deadbolt finally clicked open with a sound that was more beautiful than music. Then David's shaking fingers found the door handle, turned it, and pushed. Fresh air rushed into the smoke-filled hallway as the door swung wide, and David had never experienced anything more wonderful in his life. The cool morning breeze hit their smoke-damaged lungs like a blessing from heaven, and for a moment David thought he might cry from pure relief. "Come on, Jake," he gasped, his voice barely audible through his damaged throat. "We made it. We're safe now." Together they stumbled through the doorway and out onto the front porch. The October morning was crisp and clear, with blue sky and sunshine that seemed impossibly bright after the smoke-filled darkness of the burning house. David could hear birds singing in the distance and the normal sounds of a Saturday morning in their quiet neighborhood. Children playing, lawn mowers running, the ordinary soundtrack of peaceful suburban life. But the porch was still too close to the burning house. David could feel the heat radiating from the structure behind them, and he could hear windows starting to shatter from the thermal stress. They needed to get further away, to put distance between themselves and the inferno that had nearly claimed their lives. "Just a little further," David told Jake, though his own strength was nearly exhausted. "We need to get to the street." Using the last reserves of his physical and emotional strength, David helped Jake down the porch steps and across the small front yard toward the safety of the street. His broken leg was no longer capable of supporting any weight at all, forcing him to hop on his good leg while supporting Jake with his arm. They made it perhaps 20 feet across the lawn before David's body finally reached its absolute limit. His good leg gave out completely, his vision grayed around the edges, and he felt himself falling forward onto the cool grass with Jake collapsing beside him. David's last conscious thought as the world faded to black was a mixture of relief and love. They had made it out. They were alive. Jake was breathing, bleeding, but breathing, and they were both free from Rick's punishment room forever. Behind them, their house continued to burn with increasing intensity, consuming everything they had ever known and taking with it the only adult who had been aware of their existence. The living room windows exploded outward in a shower of glass, and flamed just as sirens began wailing in the distance, and neighbors started emerging from their houses to witness the destruction. But David Miller and his little brother Jake lay unconscious on the front lawn, their clothes torn and bloodied, their lungs full of smoke, their bodies exhausted beyond endurance, but finally, impossibly, miraculously free. As the first fire, trucks rounded the corner onto Maple Street, their sirens echoing off the houses and their emergency lights painting the morning in red and blue. Two neighbors from across the street began running toward the collapsed boys on the lawn, their faces tight with concern and their voices already calling for help. The moment that would change everything was just seconds away. Carol Henderson was watering her roses when she saw the smoke. It started as a thin, gray wisp rising from behind the Miller house across the street, barely visible against the overcast October sky. At first, she assumed it was Rick burning leaves in his backyard, though it was still early in the season for that kind of yard work. But as she watched, the smoke grew thicker and darker, taking on the acrid quality that spoke of something more serious than autumn cleanup. Carol set down her watering can and called toward the house. "Tom, come out here and look at this!" Her husband of 32 years emerged from their kitchen door, still holding the Saturday morning newspaper and wearing the old flannel shirt he reserved for weekend projects. Tom Henderson was a methodical man, slow to alarm, but quick to act when genuine problems arose. He followed Carol's pointing finger toward the Miller house and immediately understood her concern. "That's not leaf smoke," Tom said grimly. "That's structure fire." Even as he spoke, the smoke was growing more dense and urgent, billowing now from what appeared to be multiple points around the Miller house. Through the windows facing their direction, they could see an ominous orange glow that confirmed their worst fears. "Should we call the fire department?" Carol asked, though she was already heading toward the house to get the phone. "Already calling," Tom said, pulling his cell phone from his pocket as he started across the street. "But we need to make sure everyone's out of the house first." Carol Henderson had been a registered nurse for 28 years before retiring, and her instincts kicked in automatically. House fires were medical emergencies as much as property disasters. Smoke inhalation, burns, trauma from falls or debris. There were dozens of ways people could be injured even if they escaped the flames themselves. As they crossed Maple Street at a fast walk, Carol found herself thinking about the Miller family with a mixture of concern and professional assessment. Rick Miller was a difficult neighbor. Not unfriendly exactly, but distant and controlling in ways that made casual interaction uncomfortable. She had tried several times over the past 2 years to engage with him about normal neighborhood concerns, organizing block parties, coordinating snow removal, sharing information about suspicious activities. But Rick consistently deflected, such overtures with polite but firm disinterest. The children were a different story entirely. David and Jake Miller were polite, well-behaved boys who always spoke respectfully when addressed. But there was something about them that troubled Carol's nursing instincts. They were too quiet, too careful, too quick to defer to adult authority. In her professional experience, children who acted like miniature adults were often children who had been forced to grow up too quickly, usually because the adults in their lives were unreliable or dangerous. She had noticed other things too, small details that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a concerning picture. The boys were often outside during school hours without obvious supervision. They wore the same clothes multiple days in a row, and those clothes were frequently ill-fitting or inappropriate for the weather. Most telling of all, Carol had never seen them playing with other children or engaging in the kind of normal childhood activities that filled most neighborhood yards on weekends and summer evenings. When their mother died in that car accident 6 months ago, Carol had considered reaching out to offer support or assistance. But Rick's body language and curt responses to her expressions of sympathy had made it clear that he preferred to handle his grief privately. Now, standing in the street watching black smoke pour from their house, Carol wished she had been more persistent in her attempts to connect with the family. "There!" Tom shouted, pointing toward the front of the Miller house. "Someone's coming out!" Through the smoke and confusion, they could see movement on the front porch, two small figures stumbling through the doorway and out into the morning air. Even at a distance, Carol could tell immediately that these were children, not adults, and that they were in serious distress. "Those are the boys," Carol said, breaking into a run. "David and Jake." Tom was already sprinting across the Miller's front yard, his newspaper forgotten on the sidewalk. Behind them, other neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the smoke and the sound of shouting voices. Mrs. Patterson from next door was standing on her porch with a bathrobe clutched around her, and the Martinez family from 2 houses down was gathering on their front steps, the parents speaking rapidly in Spanish, while their teenage daughter held a cell phone to her ear. David and Jake had made it perhaps 20 feet across their front lawn before both boys collapsed onto the grass. From 50 feet away, Carol could see that they were unconscious, their small bodies motionless on the brown October lawn. Smoke stains darkened their pajamas, and even from a distance she could see blood on the younger child's shoulder and arm. "Call 911!" Carol shouted to anyone who could hear her as she dropped to her knees beside the boys. "Tell them we have a house fire with injuries, 2 children with smoke inhalation and possible burns." Her nursing training took over immediately. Carol checked both boys for breathing and pulse, relieved to find that while both were unconscious, their vital signs were stable. David, the older boy, had obvious injuries to his left leg, swelling and discoloration that suggested a fracture. That was several days old. Jake's shoulder and arm were bleeding from what appeared to be cuts from falling debris, but the wounds didn't look life-threatening. "Are they breathing?" Tom asked, kneeling beside his wife with his cell phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, but they've both inhaled a lot of smoke," Carol replied, tilting David's head back to clear his airway. "We need to get them further from the house in case there are explosions, but we shouldn't move them too much until the paramedics get here." Tom was already speaking to the emergency dispatcher, his voice calm but urgent. "This is Tom Henderson. At 847 Maple Street in Riverside. We have a house fire with 2 injured children. Both boys are unconscious with smoke inhalation. One appears to have a broken leg. The other has cuts and bleeding from debris." Behind them, the Miller house was now fully engulfed, flames visible through multiple windows and smoke pouring from the roof. Carol could hear sirens in the distance, fire trucks and ambulances responding to what was clearly going to be a total loss. But her immediate concern was the 2 small boys lying unconscious on the lawn, their faces pale and their breathing shallow but steady. "David," Carol said softly, gently patting the older boy's cheek. "David, can you hear me? You're safe now. You're outside and help is coming." David's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He was deeply unconscious, his body's way of protecting itself from the trauma of smoke inhalation and physical injury. But Carol had seen enough emergency situations to know that unconscious patients could sometimes hear and respond to familiar voices or reassuring words. "Jake," she tried with the younger boy. "Jake, it's Mrs. Henderson from across the street. You're going to be okay, sweetheart." Jake stirred slightly at the sound of his name, his small hand tightening around something he was clutching against his chest. Carol looked more closely and saw that it was a stuffed elephant, worn and obviously beloved, somehow preserved through their escape from the burning house. More neighbors were arriving now, drawn by the spectacle of the fire and the emergency vehicles that were beginning to arrive. Carol recognized most of them, the Johnsons from down the block, elderly Mr. Patterson, who lived alone but kept meticulous watch over the neighborhood, the young couple with the baby who had moved in just last month. They formed a respectful circle around the injured boys, offering help and asking questions in the hushed tones people used around medical emergencies. The first fire truck rounded the corner onto Maple Street, its sirens wailing and emergency lights painting the morning in red and blue strobes. Carol felt a wave of relief. Professional help was arriving, and these children would get the medical attention they desperately needed. But as the firefighters began deploying their equipment and assessing the blaze, Carol noticed something that troubled her nursing instincts. Where was Rick Miller? If there had been a house fire serious enough to require his 2 young sons to escape on their own, where was the adult who should have been protecting them? "Tom," Carol said quietly, "have you seen Rick? Did he get out?" Tom looked around the growing crowd of neighbors and emergency responders, his expression growing concerned. "I don't see him anywhere. Maybe he wasn't home." On a Saturday morning? With 2 young boys in the house? It was possible, Carol supposed. Rick could have been running errands or visiting friends, leaving the boys alone in the house when the fire started. But something about that explanation didn't sit right with her professional instincts. Children David and Jake's age shouldn't have been left unsupervised, especially not in a house with obvious fire hazards. The first ambulance arrived just as David began to stir. Carol watched the boy's face carefully as consciousness slowly returned, noting the way his eyes moved beneath closed lids and how his breathing pattern changed from the deep unconsciousness of trauma to the lighter sleep of natural recovery. "David," Carol said gently, leaning closer to his face. "David, can you hear me? You're safe now. You and Jake are both safe." David's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. He looked around wildly for a moment, clearly disoriented by finding himself on the lawn surrounded by strangers. When his gaze found Jake lying beside him, still unconscious but breathing steadily, some of the panic left his expression. "Jake," David whispered, his voice barely audible and rough from smoke damage. "Is Jake okay?" "He's going to be fine," Carol assured him, though she kept her voice professional and calm. "You both inhaled a lot of smoke, and you have some injuries that need attention, but you're both going to be okay." David tried to sit up, wincing as movement sent obvious pain through his injured leg. Carol gently pressed him back down onto the grass, her nursing training telling her to minimize movement until the paramedics could do a proper assessment. "Try to stay still for now," she said. "The ambulance is here, and they're going to take very good care of both of you." 2 paramedics approached with their equipment bags and a portable stretcher, their movements efficient and professional. Carol stepped back to give them room to work, but she stayed close enough to hear their conversation and offer information about what she had observed. 2 boys, ages approximately 6 and 9, one of the paramedics reported into his radio. Both with smoke inhalation. Older child has an apparent leg fracture that appears to be several days old. Younger child has lacerations to the shoulder and arm from debris. Several days old. Carol filed that information away in her mind, adding it to the growing list of things about this situation that troubled her. Why would a 9-year-old boy have an untreated broken leg? Why would Rick Miller not have sought medical attention for such an obvious and serious injury? "David," the paramedic said, kneeling beside the boy with practiced gentleness, "can you tell me your name and how old you are?" "David Miller," the boy whispered. "I'm 9. Is my brother okay? His name is Jake, and he's 6, and he got hurt when the ceiling fell down." "Jake is going to be fine," the paramedic assured him. "We're going to take both of you to the hospital, where the doctors can check you over and make sure you're both okay. Can you tell me what happened? How did the fire start?" David's expression grew confused and frightened. He looked around at the circle of adult faces surrounding him, paramedics, firefighters, neighbors, and Carol could see him struggling to process the situation. "I don't know," David said finally. "We were in the basement and we smelled smoke, and Rick didn't come when we called for help." "You were in the basement?" the paramedic asked, his tone carefully neutral but clearly interested. "Why were you in the basement when the fire started?" Carol watched David's face carefully as he processed this question. She saw confusion, fear, and something else. Something that looked almost like panic, as if he had said something he shouldn't have. David started, then stopped. His eyes darted around the circle of adults, and Carol could see him struggling with how to answer. "We were down there because—" He trailed off, his small face creasing with obvious distress. Carol's nursing instincts told her that this child was wrestling with more than just the trauma of escaping a house fire. There was something else going on, something that was causing him additional stress beyond the physical injuries and smoke inhalation. "It's okay," the paramedic said gently. "You don't have to explain everything right now. The important thing is that you and your brother are safe." But Carol could see that David was not comforted by this reassurance. If anything, his distress seemed to be increasing as full consciousness returned and he began to process their situation more clearly. "Where's Rick?" David asked suddenly, his voice tight with what sounded like fear. "Is Rick okay? Did he get out of the house?" "We haven't seen your father yet," Carol said carefully. "The firefighters are still checking the house. He might have been at work or running errands when the fire started." David's expression grew even more troubled. "He wasn't at work. It's Saturday, and he doesn't work on Saturdays. He was upstairs, sleeping when we smelled the smoke." The paramedics exchanged a meaningful glance over David's head. If Rick Miller had been in the house when the fire started, and if he hadn't been accounted for among the people who escaped, then this was potentially a much more serious situation than anyone had initially realized. One of the firefighters approached the group around the injured boys, his face grim behind his breathing apparatus. "We've got one adult male inside," he reported to the paramedic crew chief. "Unconscious, possible smoke inhalation, found in the living room. We're bringing him out now." Carol felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Rick was alive, which meant the boys wouldn't be orphaned by this tragedy. But if he had been unconscious during the fire, that raised new questions about how two young children had managed to escape on their own from what was clearly a serious house fire. "Is that Rick?" David asked, trying again to sit up despite the paramedic's gentle restraint. "Is he okay?" "The firefighters found a man inside the house," Carol explained. "They're bringing him out now, and he's going to get medical attention. Just like you and Jake." But David's reaction to this news was not what Carol expected. Instead of relief, she saw something that looked almost like fear cross the boy's face. His breathing quickened, and his eyes darted around the group of adults surrounding him as if he were looking for an escape route. "David," Carol said gently, "are you okay? You look upset." David started, then stopped. His small hands clenched into fists, and Carol could see him struggling with some internal conflict. "I need to tell someone something. About what happened, about why we were in the basement." The paramedic leaned closer, his expression attentive. "What is it, son? What do you need to tell us?" David looked around the circle of faces again, and Carol could see the exact moment when whatever internal struggle he was having reached its resolution. His expression changed from confused fear to desperate determination, as if he had made a decision that both terrified and relieved him. "We were locked," David whispered, his voice so quiet that everyone had to lean closer to hear him. "Rick locks us in the basement when we're bad. He calls it the punishment room." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, changing the entire atmosphere around the injured boys. Carol felt her heart skip a beat as the implications of David's statement crashed over her consciousness. The paramedic's professional expressions became more focused and alert. Even the neighbors who had been chatting quietly among themselves fell silent as David's words registered. "What do you mean locked?" the paramedic asked carefully, his training telling him to gather information without leading or influencing the child's responses. "There are locks on the outside of the door," David continued, his voice growing slightly stronger as he spoke. "Big locks that we can't open from inside. When Rick thinks we've been disrespectful or careless, he puts us down there until we learn our lesson." Carol felt sick to her stomach. As a nurse, she had seen cases of child abuse and neglect, but hearing it described in such matter-of-fact terms by a 9-year-old boy was particularly heartbreaking. The clinical part of her mind was already cataloging the implications, Isolation, psychological trauma, physical confinement, and now the horror of nearly dying in a fire because they couldn't escape from their prison. "How long were you locked in the basement this time?" the paramedic asked. "Since yesterday night," David replied. "Jake pet the neighbor's cat without asking permission, and Rick said that showed we don't respect other people's property." Tom Henderson, who had been listening to this conversation with growing horror, suddenly spoke up. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You mean those boys were locked in the basement all night? During a house fire?" David nodded miserably. "We couldn't get out when we smelled the smoke. The door was locked like always, and Rick didn't come when we called for help. I had to break the door with a pipe to get us out." Carol looked at David's injured leg with new understanding. "Is that how you hurt your leg? Breaking down the door?" "No," David said quietly. "Rick did that a few days ago when I tried to stop him from hurting Jake. He kicked me, and something cracked." The circle of adults around the injured boys had gone completely silent. Carol could see the shock and revulsion on every face, the dawning realization that they had been living across the street from a situation of systematic child abuse without recognizing the signs or intervening to help. "David," Carol said gently, "Rick can't hurt you anymore. Do you understand that? What he was doing to you and Jake, locking you in the basement, hurting you, that's not okay. Adults aren't supposed to treat children that way." David's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "I know. But we didn't have anywhere else to go after Mom died. And Rick said if we ever told anyone about the punishment room, he would make sure we disappeared where no one would ever find us." Tom Henderson pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. "I'm calling the police," he announced to the group. "This isn't just a house fire anymore. This is a criminal investigation." As Tom spoke to the emergency dispatcher, reporting suspected child abuse in addition to the fire and medical emergency, Carol continued to monitor both boys' condition. Jake was beginning to stir, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. His grip on the stuffed elephant was still strong, and his breathing was steady and improving. "Jake," Carol said softly, "can you hear me, sweetheart? You're safe now." Jake's eyes opened slowly, immediately seeking out his brother. When he saw David lying beside him on the grass, surrounded by adults in uniforms, his small face crumpled with confusion and fear. "David," Jake whispered, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. "Where are we? What happened to our house?" "There was a fire, buddy," David replied, reaching over to take his little brother's hand. "But we got out. We're safe now." Jake looked around at the crowd of strangers surrounding them, his 6-year-old mind clearly struggling to process the situation. "Where's Rick? Is he angry about the fire?" The innocent question sent another wave of heartbreak through the assembled adults. Even after everything they had endured, Jake's first concern was whether their abuser would be angry about circumstances beyond their control. "Rick can't be angry with you anymore," Carol said gently. "He can't lock you in the basement or hurt you ever again. There are going to be people whose job it is to make sure you're both safe from now on." Jake looked confused but hopeful. "People who won't lock us up?" "That's right," Carol confirmed. "People who understand that children should never be locked up or hurt by adults who are supposed to take care of them." The paramedics were preparing to transport both boys to the hospital, loading Jake onto a small stretcher while helping David into a sitting position on a second gurney. As they worked, Carol noticed that several police cars had arrived, and officers were beginning to establish a crime scene perimeter around the burned house. "Mrs. Henderson," David said as the paramedics prepared to load him into the ambulance, "will you make sure they know about the punishment room? The locks on the door and the pipe I used to break it? I want them to see it so they know I'm telling the truth." "I'll make sure they know everything," Carol promised. "And David, you were very brave today. You saved your brother's life." David nodded solemnly, his small hand still holding Jake's as they were loaded into the ambulance. "I promised him I would always protect him, even if it meant getting in trouble with Rick." As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Carol stood in the street watching it disappear around the corner. Around her, firefighters continued to battle the blaze that had consumed the Miller house. But the real fire, the one that had been burning in the basement punishment room for 2 years, had finally been extinguished. Tom put his arm around his wife's shoulders as they watched the emergency vehicles work. "How did we not know?" he asked quietly. "How did we live across the street from those children for 2 years and not realize what was happening to them?" Carol shook her head, her professional mind already analyzing the signs they had missed, the opportunities for intervention that had passed unrecognized. "Child abusers are often very good at hiding what they do," she said. "They isolate their victims, threaten them into silence, and maintain a normal appearance to the outside world. But a punishment room? Locking children in the basement? It's more common than you'd think," Carol replied sadly. "And Rick probably convinced himself that he was just being a strict disciplinarian, that he was teaching the boys important lessons about respect and consequences." A police detective approached them, notebook in hand, and expression grim. "I'm Detective Sarah Martinez," she introduced herself. "I understand you were the first people to reach the children?" Carol nodded. "We saw the smoke and came over to help. The boys collapsed on the lawn after escaping from the house." "And they told you about being locked in the basement?" "David did," Carol confirmed. "He said Rick Miller regularly locked both boys in what he called a punishment room in the basement. They couldn't escape when the fire started because the door was locked from the outside," Detective Martinez wrote rapidly in her notebook. "We'll need formal statements from both of you, and we'll want you to testify about what the children told you. This is going to be a major criminal case." As they gave their preliminary statements to the detective, Carol found herself thinking about David and Jake Miller, 2 small boys who had survived not just a house fire, but years of systematic abuse and neglect. They would need medical treatment, psychological counseling, and safe placement with people who understood how to help traumatized children heal. But they had also survived. Against all odds, a 9-year-old boy with a broken leg had managed to break down a locked door, navigate through a burning house, and save both himself and his little brother from a situation that could easily have killed them both. As the last of the Miller house collapsed in on itself, sending sparks and smoke high into the October sky, Carol Henderson made a silent promise to herself and to the 2 brave boys now on their way to the hospital. She would make sure that David and Jake Miller never spent another night locked in anyone's punishment room. They had suffered enough, and they deserved the chance to discover what childhood could be like when adults protected rather than harmed the children in their care. The nightmare was over. The healing could begin. 3 weeks after the fire that changed everything, Detective Sarah Martinez stood in the basement of what had once been the Miller house on Maple Street, examining the remains of what 9-year-old David Miller had called the punishment room. The October fire had gutted most of the upper floors with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind a skeleton of charred timber and twisted metal. But the concrete basement had survived largely intact, preserving crucial evidence that would be vital to the prosecution of Rick Miller. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of sharp autumn air that made everything seem more vivid and immediate. Martinez had been a detective for 15 years, specializing in crimes against children, and she had learned to compartmentalize her emotions when examining crime scenes. But there was something about this particular basement that made her professional detachment more difficult to maintain. The locks were exactly as David had described them during his initial interview at the hospital. Heavy-duty deadbolts installed on the outside of a reinforced oak door, impossible to open from within. Martinez photographed each lock mechanism from multiple angles, documenting the evidence that would prove Rick Miller had systematically imprisoned 2 young children in this windowless concrete room. The doorframe told its own horrific story. Deep gouges from the metal pipe David had used to break their way to freedom scarred the wood around the primary deadbolt. Splintered fragments still littered the floor, where a 9-year-old boy with a broken leg had literally beaten down the barrier that separated him and his brother from almost certain death by smoke inhalation. Martinez crouched down to examine the gouges more closely, trying to imagine the desperation and determination it must have taken for an injured child to accomplish what grown men with proper tools might have struggled to do. Each mark in the wood represented another swing of that makeshift battering ram, another moment when David had chosen to endure agony in his broken leg rather than accept that he and Jake would die trapped in Rick's twisted version of discipline. The basement contained other evidence too, details that painted a comprehensive picture of the systematic abuse the Miller boys had endured. Scratch marks on the concrete walls showed where small fingers had clawed at unyielding surfaces during hours or days of confinement. Worn spots on the concrete floor marked the paths where children had paced in desperate circles, trapped animals looking for escape that never came. In one corner, Martinez found the makeshift toilet David had mentioned, a white plastic bucket with a cracked lid, positioned beside a larger bucket that had apparently served as their only source of drinking water during extended imprisonments. The sight of these crude facilities spoke to the extended nature of the confinements Rick had imposed, transforming what might have been brief punishments into prolonged torture sessions. But perhaps most damning of all was what Martinez found when she examined the door itself more carefully. Scratched into the wood at child height, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, were hash marks. Dozens of them, carved with what looked like a nail or small piece of metal. Someone had been keeping count of something, marking time in the only way available to them. Martinez photographed the hash marks carefully, her mind already working through the implications. Had the boys been counting hours, days, individual confinement sessions? Whatever they represented, they spoke to a level of systematic abuse that went far beyond momentary losses of temper or overly strict discipline. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the pediatric physician who had been treating both boys since their arrival at Riverside General Hospital. Both patients stable and improving. David's leg surgery successful, healing ahead of schedule. Jake showing remarkable progress in trauma counseling. Ready for your follow-up interview when convenient. Martinez pocketed the phone and took one last comprehensive look around the punishment room. In 3 decades of police work, she had seen humanity at its worst: murders, assaults, robberies, domestic violence in every imaginable form. She had investigated cases involving serial killers, organized crime, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. But there was something particularly heartbreaking about crimes against children, especially when those crimes were perpetrated by the very adults who were supposed to protect and nurture them. The systematic nature of Rick Miller's abuse was what made it so disturbing. This wasn't a case of momentary anger leading to regrettable violence. This was calculated, methodical psychological and physical torture, designed and implemented over a period of years by someone who had convinced himself that he was providing necessary discipline to ungrateful children. Rick Miller had been charged with 2 counts of child endangerment, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment resulting in serious bodily harm, and terroristic threatening. The fire itself had been ruled accidental. Rick had passed out drunk while cooking breakfast, leaving a pan of grease unattended on the stove until it ignited and spread throughout the house. But the fact that 2 children had nearly died because they were locked in a basement during that fire elevated all the charges to felony level. Rick's blood alcohol level on the morning of the fire had been measured at 0.24, nearly 3 times the legal limit for driving and high enough to cause serious impairment of judgment and motor function. The investigation had revealed a pattern of heavy drinking that stretched back to shortly after his marriage to the boy's mother, suggesting that alcohol had been a contributing factor in his abusive behavior from the beginning. His public defender, an overworked attorney named James Crawford, who specialized in hopeless cases, was already making noises about a plea bargain. Crawford had reviewed the evidence and understood that taking this case to trial would likely result in the maximum possible sentence for his client. But Martinez was prepared to recommend against any plea deal that didn't include significant prison time. Rick Miller needed to be kept away from children for as long as the law would allow. 45 minutes later, Martinez walked through the pediatric ward of Riverside General Hospital, her badge and identification clearing the way past protective nurses and security checkpoints. The hospital had implemented special security protocols for David and Jake Miller, ensuring that only authorized personnel could access their rooms. There had been concerns that Rick might have friends or relatives who shared his twisted views about child discipline, and no one wanted to take chances with the boy's safety. The pediatric ward was designed to be as non-institutional as possible, with colorful murals on the walls and child-friendly artwork that helped young patients feel less intimidated by the medical environment. But despite the cheerful decorations, Martinez could see the underlying security measures: cameras at every corridor junction, electronic locks on patient room doors, and staff members who paid careful attention to anyone who didn't belong. David's room was at the end of the hallway, positioned so that nurses could easily monitor who came and went. Through the open door, Martinez could see him sitting up in bed with a thick book in his lap, his injured left leg elevated and encased in a bright blue cast that extended from his ankle to his hip. The surgeons had needed to re-break and properly set the bone Rick had fractured with his boot, a procedure that had required general anesthesia and the insertion of metal pins to ensure proper healing. Despite everything he had endured, David looked remarkably healthy. 3 weeks of proper nutrition, medical care, and the absence of constant fear had worked wonders on his 9-year-old constitution. His face had filled out slightly, losing the hollow-cheeked appearance that had been so noticeable when he first arrived at the hospital. His hair, which had been dirty and unkempt when the paramedics found him on the lawn, was now clean and neatly trimmed by one of the hospital volunteers, who specialized in helping child patients feel better about their appearance. "David," Martinez said, knocking gently on the doorframe, "how are you feeling today?" David looked up from his book, a collection of adventure stories about children who overcame difficult circumstances through courage and ingenuity, carefully, chosen by the hospital's child life specialist to provide positive role models without being too obviously therapeutic. His face lit up with a smile that was still tentative, as if he weren't entirely sure that smiling was safe, but was genuine, and reached his eyes in a way that hadn't been possible during their first interview 3 weeks ago. "Much better, thank you," David replied with the careful politeness that would probably take years of therapy to overcome. "The doctors say my leg is healing really well, better than they expected for someone my age." Martinez entered the room and settled into the comfortable visitor's chair beside David's bed. The furniture had been chosen specifically for family interactions, with soft cushions and a design that encouraged adults to sit at eye level with child patients rather than looming over them. She had conducted hundreds of interviews with child victims over the years, and she had learned that patience and gentleness were far more effective than aggressive questioning when it came to getting accurate information from traumatized children. The room itself had been personalized during David's stay. Get-well cards from his classmates covered one wall, along with artwork created by Jake during his art therapy sessions. A small collection of books donated by community members filled a shelf near the window, and stuffed animals given by hospital volunteers crowded the windowsill. It looked like the room of a child who was loved and cared for, rather than the sterile medical environment David had first encountered. "I wanted to check in with you about a few things," Martinez said, pulling out her notebook. "Nothing scary or difficult, just some details about what happened that will help us make sure Rick can never hurt you or Jake again." David nodded solemnly, closing his book and giving Martinez his full attention. "I want to help. I want to make sure he can't lock other kids up either." The maturity in David's response was both impressive and heartbreaking. At 9 years old, he had already developed the kind of protective instincts and sense of social responsibility that most people didn't acquire until adulthood. His experiences had forced him to think beyond his own immediate welfare, to consider the broader implications of speaking out against his abuser. "That's very brave of you," Martinez said, pulling out her notebook. "Can you tell me more about how long you and Jake were usually kept in the basement? You mentioned that this last time was overnight, but were there other times when it was longer?" David considered the question carefully, his young face serious with the weight of memory. Martinez could see him mentally reviewing incidents, sorting through 2 years of systematic abuse to provide accurate information. Usually, it was just a few hours, David said slowly. Like after school until dinner time, or from dinner time until bedtime. But sometimes it was much longer. The longest was 3 days, right after Christmas last year. Can you tell me what happened that time? David's expression grew troubled, and Martinez could see him struggling with memories that were clearly among his most difficult. We had gotten Christmas presents from our grandparents, Mom's parents, who live in Vancouver. They sent us some clothes and books and a new stuffed animal for Jake. I wanted to call them to say thank you, like Mom used to make us do. But Rick said that showed I didn't appreciate what he provided for us, that I was trying to make him look bad by acting like he didn't take good enough care of us. Martinez wrote rapidly, noting not just the length of the punishment, but Rick's paranoid interpretation of normal childhood behavior. The need to control every aspect of the boys' lives, including their relationships with extended family, was a classic sign of an abusive personality. During those 3 days, did Rick provide food or water? Not food, David said quietly. He said part of learning was understanding what it felt like to go without things we took for granted. There was always a bucket of water in the corner, but he would only refill it once a day and we had to make it last. What about bathroom facilities? David's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but he answered honestly. There was another bucket for that. Rick said privacy was a privilege that had to be earned through good behavior, and that learning to be uncomfortable would make us more appreciative of normal life. Martinez made careful notes, building the detailed picture of systematic abuse that would be crucial for the prosecution. Every detail David provided painted Rick Miller not as a strict but loving disciplinarian, but as a sadistic individual who had found legally protected ways to torture 2 vulnerable children. David, Martinez said gently, I know this is difficult to talk about, but can you tell me about other times when Rick hurt you physically? Besides the incident with your leg, I mean. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as he considered the question. Martinez had learned to recognize this particular kind of silence. It wasn't resistance or reluctance to cooperate, but the careful mental sorting that traumatized children did when trying to distinguish between different types of abuse they had experienced. He didn't hit us very often, David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Not like punching or slapping the way some of the kids at school talked about their parents when they got really mad. But he would grab our arms really hard when he was angry, hard enough to leave fingerprint marks that lasted for days. Martinez nodded, encouraging him to continue without pushing too hard. And he would push us down the stairs to the basement. Instead of letting us walk down normally, David continued. He said it was more efficient that way, and that we needed to learn not to waste his time with slow, deliberate movements. Jake fell a couple of times and got bruises on his knees and elbows, but Rick said that was our fault for not being more coordinated. Did anyone else ever see these marks? Teachers, neighbors, other adults? I was really careful to wear long sleeves when the finger marks were bad, David explained. Even in hot weather, I would wear sweatshirts or long-sleeve shirts to school. And if anyone asked about bruises that showed, Rick taught us to say we got hurt playing or riding our bikes or falling out of trees. Martinez could picture the careful choreography David had learned to perform, the constant vigilance required to hide evidence of abuse while maintaining the appearance of normal childhood activities. It was exhausting to contemplate, let alone live through day after day. Rick said if we ever told anyone the truth about his discipline methods, we would be separated and put in different foster homes, where we would never see each other again, David continued. He had lots of stories about kids who got split up and never saw their brothers and sisters again. Martinez nodded, understanding now how Rick had maintained his abuse for so long. The threat of separation was particularly cruel when used against children who had already lost their mother and had only each other for emotional support and protection. "What about Jake?" Martinez asked. "Has he been able to talk about what happened to you both?" "A little," David said. "The counselor here says it's normal for younger kids to have trouble with words when scary things happen to them. But he's been drawing pictures that show the basement and the locks and Rick standing over us. The counselor says that's his way of telling the story when he doesn't have the right words." Through the window of David's room, Martinez could see into the adjacent room, where Jake was having his daily session with Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery for young children. The 6-year-old was seated at a small table covered with art supplies, creating detailed drawings that served as both therapy and evidence of the abuse he had suffered. Dr. Chen had explained to Martinez that children Jake's age often processed traumatic experiences through play and artistic expression, rather than verbal recounting. His drawings were remarkably detailed and consistent, showing the basement room with its locks and buckets, stick figures representing himself and David huddled together, and a large, threatening figure that clearly represented Rick. "David," Martinez said, "there's something else I need to ask you about. During our first interview, you mentioned that Rick sometimes threatened to make you and Jake disappear if you told anyone about the punishment room. Can you tell me more about those specific threats?" David's expression grew deeply troubled, and Martinez could see him struggling with memories that were clearly among his most frightening. His hands clenched slightly on the hospital blanket, and his breathing became more shallow, physiological responses that indicated he was accessing particularly traumatic memories. He would say things like, "Children disappear all the time, and nobody ever finds them," David recounted slowly. "He told us about kids who got taken away from their families for complaining about discipline, and how they were never seen again because nobody wanted ungrateful children who didn't appreciate good homes." Martinez wrote carefully, noting not just the content of the threats, but David's physical responses to recounting them. This information would be crucial for establishing the psychological torture Rick had inflicted alongside the physical abuse. "Did he ever describe specific ways he might hurt you, or specific places he might take you?" David nodded reluctantly, his voice dropping even lower. "He said the punishment room wasn't the worst place he could put us. He said there were places where kids went where nobody could hear them scream, and nobody would ever think to look for them. He described old abandoned buildings and deep holes in the ground where people dumped things they wanted to get rid of." Martinez felt her jaw clench with anger, but she kept her voice gentle and professional. Rick Miller's threats went far beyond ordinary child abuse. They constituted terroristic threatening and psychological torture designed to ensure his victims' absolute silence and compliance. "He also said he knew people who made problems disappear," David continued, his voice barely audible now. "He said there were men who owed him favors from when he was in the army, and that some problems were better solved permanently than temporarily." Martinez made detailed notes, recognizing that these threats might constitute additional criminal charges if she could establish that Rick had specific individuals in mind when making them. The reference to military connections was particularly concerning, suggesting that Rick might have had access to people with specialized knowledge about making people vanish without a trace. "David, I want you to understand something very important," Martinez said, leaning forward to make sure she had the boy's full attention. "Rick will never be able to hurt you or Jake again. He's going to prison for a very long time, and even when he eventually gets out, there will be legal protections in place to make sure he can never contact you or come near you." "What about when we get older?" David asked, showing the kind of long-term thinking that was remarkable in a 9-year-old, but heartbreaking in its implications. "What if he tries to find us when we're adults, and he thinks we can't get him in trouble anymore?" It was a sophisticated question that showed how deeply Rick's threats had affected David's sense of security and safety. Martinez had to resist the urge to make promises she couldn't guarantee while still providing the reassurance this traumatized child desperately needed. "The law will protect you for as long as necessary," Martinez said carefully. "And by the time you're adults, you'll be strong enough and smart enough to protect yourselves if you ever need to. But more importantly, Rick is going to be a very old man by the time he gets out of prison, if he gets out at all. The charges against him are serious, and judges don't like people who hurt children. David nodded, some of the tension leaving his small frame. The social worker said we're going to live with a foster family soon. People who know how to take care of kids who have been through bad things. That's right, Martinez confirmed. Actually, the Hendersons, the neighbors who found you after the fire, have been asking about the process to become your permanent guardians. They want to make sure you and Jake stay together and get all the help you need to recover from what you've been through. David's face lit up with the first genuinely happy expression Martinez had seen from him during any of their interactions. The transformation was remarkable. For just a moment he looked like what he was supposed to be, a normal 9-year-old boy with hopes and dreams and the possibility of a happy future ahead of him. Really, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson want us to live with them permanently? They've already started the paperwork to become your legal guardians, Martinez said. Carol Henderson was a pediatric nurse before she retired, so she understands about helping children heal from difficult experiences. And Tom Henderson has talked to his employer about flexible scheduling so he can be available whenever you or Jake need him. The transformation in David's demeanor was remarkable. His posture straightened, his breathing became deeper and more regular, and the constant wariness that had characterized all their previous interactions seemed to fade. For the first time since Martinez had met him, David looked like he might actually believe that good things could happen to him. "Will we be safe there?" David asked. "I mean, really safe? Not just for now, but forever? Rick won't be able to find us, or hurt us, or take us back to another punishment room?" "You'll be as safe as any children anywhere," Martinez promised. "The Hendersons understand what you've been through, and they know how to help kids recover from trauma. Plus, there will be counselors and social workers checking on you regularly to make sure everything is going well. And there will be legal protections in place that will last until you're adults." David was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly or hope too easily. Martinez could see him mentally examining her promises, looking for potential weaknesses or exceptions that might allow Rick to hurt them again. "Detective Martinez," David said finally, "can I ask you something that might sound stupid?" "There are no stupid questions, David. What's on your mind? Did we do the right thing? Telling everyone about the punishment room and what Rick did to us? Sometimes I lie awake at night worrying that we should have just stayed quiet like Rick said. And maybe things would have been better if we had just tried harder to be good." Martinez felt her heart break a little at the question. Even after everything he had endured, David was still carrying guilt about exposing his abuser, a common response among child victims who had been systematically conditioned to blame themselves for their suffering. "David," Martinez said firmly, "you absolutely did the right thing. What Rick was doing to you and Jake was not discipline, it was abuse. Adults are supposed to protect children and help them learn and grow, not lock them up and hurt them and threaten them with worse punishments." She leaned forward in her chair, making sure David could see the sincerity in her expression. "By telling the truth about what happened to you, you probably saved other children from going through the same thing." "Other children? Rick won't ever be able to adopt or foster children now," Martinez explained. "His name will be on databases that prevent people with histories of child abuse from getting access to vulnerable kids. If he had stayed free and never been caught, he might have found other children to hurt after you and Jake grew up and moved away." David considered this information with the seriousness that had been forced on him by circumstances no child should ever face. But Martinez could see that the idea of protecting other children resonated with him in a way that protecting himself hadn't. It was easier for him to see the value in his courage when it was framed in terms of helping others rather than helping himself. "I'm glad we told," David said finally. "Jake deserves to be safe. All kids do." Martinez closed her notebook and prepared to leave, but David's voice stopped her before she reached the door. "Detective Martinez, Will you tell Mr. and Mrs. Henderson thank you from me and Jake for finding us and for wanting to take care of us and for believing us when we told them about the punishment room? I'll tell them, Martinez promised. But you'll be able to thank them yourself very soon. The paperwork should be finished within the week, and then you and Jake can go home with them. Home, David repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue to see how it felt. That sounds really good. As Martinez left the hospital and drove back to the police station, she reflected on the remarkable resilience of children and the equally remarkable capacity of some adults to inflict suffering on the most vulnerable members of society. David and Jake Miller had survived 2 years of systematic abuse, had nearly died in a house fire, and were now facing the challenge of learning to trust adults again after being betrayed by the person who should have protected them most. But they were healing, both physically and emotionally, with the help of caring medical professionals, skilled therapists, and the promise of a safe, loving home with people who understood that children deserve protection rather than punishment. The human capacity for recovery, especially in children, never ceased to amaze Martinez, even after 15 years of working with victims of the worst crimes imaginable. Rick Miller, meanwhile, was sitting in the county jail awaiting trial, his bail set so high that even his most generous relatives couldn't afford to post it. His public defender had already approached the prosecutor about a plea agreement, but Martinez was confident that the evidence was strong enough to guarantee a lengthy prison sentence, whether Rick pled guilty or took his chances with a jury. The physical evidence from the punishment room was overwhelming. The photographs of the locks, the makeshift toilet facilities, the scratch marks on the walls, and most damning of all, those hash marks carved into the door at child height. Evidence that the boys had been keeping count of their imprisonments. Combined with David's detailed testimony and Jake's drawings, it painted a picture of systematic abuse that no reasonable person could dismiss as overly strict discipline. But more than the physical evidence, it was David's whispered confession on that October morning that had changed everything. Those few words, "We were locked. Rick's punishment room. He locks us in the basement when we're bad," had transformed 2 abused children into survivors, turned a neglectful community into advocates, and ensured that one dangerous man would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent children. 3 months later, on a cold January morning, Detective Martinez received an envelope in the mail with her name written in careful 9-year-old handwriting. Inside was a hand-drawn card showing a house with 2 stick-figure children playing in a snow-covered yard, supervised by 2 smiling adults who were clearly meant to be the Hendersons. The front of the card was decorated with markers and colored pencils, showing remarkable artistic skill for someone David's age. But it was the message inside that made Martinez smile and carefully pin the card to her office bulletin board next to photographs and thank you notes from other children she had helped over the years. In David's careful handwriting, the message read, "Dear Detective Martinez, thank you for helping us find our real home and for making sure Rick can never hurt kids again. We are very happy with our new family and Jake is doing much better. He talks more now and doesn't have as many bad dreams. I am going to be in the school play next month and Jake is learning to play soccer. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson say we can call them Mom and Dad now if we want to. We wanted you to know that we are safe and happy. Love, David and Jake Miller Henderson." Martinez smiled and added the card to her growing collection of success stories. Each card represented a life saved, a family healed, a future made possible by adults who refused to ignore the suffering of children. In a job that often exposed her to the worst aspects of human nature, these reminders of resilience and recovery were what kept her going. The punishment room was gone forever, destroyed by the same fire that had nearly claimed the lives of its victims. But the love and safety that had replaced it in David and Jake's lives would last a lifetime, growing stronger with each passing day, as 2 brave boys learned that adults could be trusted to protect rather than harm the children in their care. 6 months later, Martinez attended David and Jake's official adoption ceremony at the Riverside County Courthouse. The boys stood between Tom and Carol Henderson, wearing matching blue suits and expressions of nervous excitement as Judge Patricia Williams made their new family legal and permanent. When the judge asked if they understood that Tom and Carol were now their parents forever, David answered for both of them. "Yes, Your Honor. We understand that we're safe now, and that we'll never have to go back to any punishment room ever. Again." As Martinez watched the new family embrace after the ceremony, she reflected on the power of truth to transform lives. David's whispered confession on that October morning had set in motion a chain of events that led directly to this moment. Two children who had been trapped in a nightmare finding their way to a dream they had probably never dared to imagine possible. The whispered truth had indeed changed everything. And sometimes, Martinez reflected, that was exactly how justice worked, not through dramatic courtroom confrontations or elaborate investigations, but through the simple courage of a child who found the strength to speak the truth when it mattered most.